Spoiler warning, the following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. I've called movies unforgivably bad before, but rarely have I seen a movie I would call forgivably bad, and I put Buffy the Vampire Slayer in that category. Sure, a lot of people hate this movie, but I guess that most of them were big fans of the TV show, if not Joss Whedon's work on the whole. They hate this movie because it doesn't reflect Whedon's vision for the Buffy character, and because they know if he had been given more creative control, it would have been a better movie. I can't argue with that. At the same time, I also would wager most viewers who have seen this and don't know, don't like, or don't care about the series would forget this movie before they had a chance to hate it. If you're a huge Joss Whedon fan, I could understand if you're really against this movie after 7 seasons of Buffy, 5 seasons of Angel, and the really successful comic book run after that if you're counting those. Because if Buffy had never been on television, this would be all we'd have ever gotten from this character, and she'd have been nearly entirely forgotten. On the other hand, had this movie not been made, we wouldn't have had anything I just mentioned. It wasn't even Joss Whedon's idea to make it into a show. That was Gail Berman, a network executive who came to Whedon with the idea and he accepted. Apparently a lot of people in Hollywood really liked Whedon's original movie script, but the people who actually made the film interpreted it differently from how Whedon saw it. The director, Fran Kuzui, saw it as a comedy about how society sees vampires, while Whedon, of course, was writing about how society sees women, wanting to portray a girl as a real hero. Though I don't really understand her vision, because the places where the film is the most watchable is where Whedon's ideas for a strong female protagonist are largely left intact, and where it's at its most incomprehensible is in its vampire mythos. But while at best it's unmemorable, I don't think it's terrible, especially if you look at it with perspective and try to put yourself in 1992 before you could have compared it to the TV show. If you never watched this movie and just listened to Buffy fans talk about it, you'd probably think that Whedon's original script was completely thrown out and only the name and a loose outline of the premise remained. But that's not entirely true. The comic Buffy the Vampire Slayer: The Origin, put out in 1999 and based on Whedon's original script, is surprisingly close to the movie, even repeating a good portion of the same dialogue. There are a number of distinct Whedonisms. While you can't be sure what was added or what was taken away, if you know Whedon's writing, you can certainly pick out lines that were definitely his. And while often buried and not necessarily well executed, the ideals of female empowerment are still there. So that's where I get off calling this movie forgivably bad. Whedon himself has said the movie isn't without merit. I really think most of the problems lie in interpretation and execution rather than in story and characterization, and so I'll be focusing on what the script seems to be trying to do versus what we actually see on screen. Several viewers have questioned whether this movie counts as a superhero film, a question that comes up more and more these days, but I don't think she's missing very much besides a costume, unless you count slaying vampires wearing a cheerleader outfit. It's your basic superhero origin story with a horror comedy twist. A regular person, in this case a high school cheerleader, finds out she has superpowers, has a mentor who teaches her how to use them, what they're for, and the responsibility that goes along with them. She has to make a choice about whether she'll ignore her calling or accept it, as she's the latest in a long legacy, like the Blue Beetle or the Phantom. And also, like a lot of generational superheroes, she's the only one and also the chosen one. Like Peter Parker in Spider-Man 2, she tries to fight her calling, but she's naturally too noble to ignore the opportunities to help others that force themselves upon her, in this case, saving them from vampires. And making her a stereotypical cheerleader at the beginning is a smart move. Not only does the movie get some comedy mileage out of this, especially considering the movie was sold on the absurd notion of a cheerleader who slays vampires, but it also provides a natural direction for her character arc and a potentially convincing opportunity for change. She defines her priorities precisely, which are exactly the same as her peers naturally, when she says, I don't want to be the chosen one, I don't want to spend my whole life fighting vampires, all I want to do is graduate from high school, go to Europe, marry Christian Slater, and die. Even after Merrick proves she has supernatural abilities by throwing a knife at her head and she catches it without thinking, unfortunately one of the very few real displays of power we see from her the whole film, Buffy still refuses to accept her fated role until she punches him in the face and likes it. I think maybe there's a certain novelty that sets in at that point, where she trains out of curiosity, excited to see what she's capable of, but still not grasping the reality and the danger of her situation. And that idea is reinforced by the training montage, in which, over and over, she can't remember to aim for the heart when trying to kill a vampire. Maybe she just goes along with it because, for a while, it's fun. The movie is very awkward in its tone. It can't find that delicate balance between comedy and drama that a thing like this requires if you want it to be anything more than a farce. But the one place where it really demands itself to be taken seriously, and probably one of the scenes that didn't deviate much from what Whedon originally wrote, is Buffy's first real moment of clarity when she fully realizes there are a lot more important things in life than shaking pom-poms and going to school dances. That's the scene where she confronts her friends before the dance, showing up late to their decorating meeting because she was busy watching helplessly under Lothos' spell as he murdered Merrick, the Watcher. Following Merrick's earlier advice, she can't tell them she's the Slayer for fear that it might get back to the vampires. But she's not acting stuck up and snobbish anymore like the rest of them because she's gained perspective and is figuring out how fake she used to be. They're angry with her for putting something else above their cheerleading responsibilities, and one of her friends says she's like the thing from another tax bracket, which is the perfect proof of how out of whack their priorities are. They haven't even noticed the people who have died or disappeared because all they're aware of are all the politics of petty high school popularity. Buffy responds to their disapproval with, "I think reality stepped out of here about 5 minutes ago," and then, "Excuse me for doing something important." The movie has moments of lucidity like this, where it's almost hard to believe it's saying something about problems with real-life social dynamics because so much of it is silly or confusing or awkward, and I'll get to some of those moments a little later. But Buffy becomes an even more complex character when, realizing how serious the world is from how she imagined it, she tries again to ignore her calling, now because she doesn't think she's up to the challenge, not because she's ignorant, naive, and simple-minded like she was before. When Pike insists she fights Lothos and the vampires, she says she's just like the other cheerleaders, trying to convince herself that's true so she won't have to face her inevitable responsibilities, and goes to the dance, trying to hide behind her old life. Of course, her destiny comes to her, and she's forced to fight the vampires anyway. But the question is, now that she has a taste of reality, and I realize how silly that sounds in this context with what these vampires look like, would she really be happy if she did achieve that original goal of, quote, graduating high school and marrying Christian Slater? I doubt it. While this character development is really the best thing going on in the movie, Kristi Swanson's performance often gets in the way. She seems to think she's making a simple teen farce comedy along with the director, and she seems almost more comfortable playing in the overly silly action scenes than she is in the scenes with the most meat in them. It's like what real substance is here is getting in the way of the movie she thinks she's making. And I'll take this opportunity to say now, and maybe this is a low blow, but I can't help but wonder how Fran Kuzui, a female director, could be so much less interested in the female empowerment aspect of this than the man who wrote the script. Anyway, Swanson has her moments. She really does okay with the aforementioned scene where she tells her fellow cheerleaders they need a reality check, and I wish we'd seen her step up like that more often. But the problem is, the majority of the cast has a lot more screen presence than she does. She just can't carry this by herself, and so all that character stuff I spelled out earlier loses some of its weight because she's outshined by Pike, played by Luke Perry in one of his earliest roles. She's supposed to be the strong, confident hero, and he's supposed to be the damsel in distress in a clever role reversal. But it's not really convincing because he's acting circles around her, and he clearly has a better handle on his role than she has on hers. There's not much chemistry here, but he's really trying. And don't get me wrong, I think she is too. I just don't think she was right for this part. It seems like she was cast because she can play an airhead. But what you need is a girl who thinks she's an airhead, but there's really something a lot deeper behind her eyes, an untapped potential that she begins to find over the course of the film. That's what's happening in the script, but it's hard to see it on screen. And the humor, some of which is legitimately quite funny on the page, loses its punch because Swanson doesn't seem to get it, so she doesn't deliver it right. Not all the time. Her delivery of "Pike isn't a name, it's a fish" is very funny, but she puts emphasis in the wrong place in the sentence where Merrick comes into the locker room and she says, "You can't be in here, this is a naked place," a line that would have worked if Sarah Michelle Gellar had said it. Pike has a pretty good character arc as well, and as I said, we luckily have an actor who fits it. He goes from a loser coward who drinks too much, faints at any danger, and runs from all his problems, to Buffy's brave and level-headed boyfriend who serves as her voice of reason. Their arcs parallel each other. She's just doing what's expected of her until she has a loss of innocence, and he does the same thing. He acts like a womanizer along with his friend Benny before Benny gets turned, but early on, we see that while he acts like a jerk, he has higher standards than his friend, when he's appalled that Benny would sleep with girls he doesn't like and says aren't even human, which is a cool irony, by the way, since moments afterward, he is transformed into a vampire and really isn't human himself. Both Buffy and Pike try to run from their problems at first, but Pike, since he doesn't have this looming destiny, is a little quicker to accept that vampires are terrorizing the city and tries to convince Buffy to let him help her remedy that. He's very likable and is probably the most successful translation from script to screen. Now, before I talk a little about Merrick, I should also probably mention that Donald Sutherland is the reason Joss Whedon stopped coming to the set after being there through most of the filming, because he was apparently horribly ungracious and really condescending about the whole thing. In the little 4-minute TV featurette made at the same time of the film's release, Sutherland is interviewed for all of 15 seconds, and all we hear from him is how he didn't want to admit to anyone that he was making a movie called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I don't know why he agreed to do the film if he thought it was such a stupid premise and a waste of time, unless he just was desperate for work, and according to Whedon, he kept rewriting his own dialogue and saying things that didn't make sense. I can't tell watching exactly where that happens, but despite what happened on set, I think his performance is mostly fine. There's some subtle comedy in his no-nonsense, expressionless approach, and I really like the occasional over-the-top gestures he makes. But despite performance, Merrick ultimately comes off as a giant plot device because of the bizarre mythos of how the Watcher functions with the Slayer in this. Merrick is reborn every time he dies to train a new Slayer, though we're not told if he lives entire lives or if he returns a grown old man every time. From flashbacks, we can at least deduce that he comes back as the exact same man and it's not a reincarnation. The problem with this is, his death is a major turning point for Buffy. It's where things get the most real for her, and it's hard to really appreciate that when you know he'll just come back to life again later. Unless being killed by Lothos somehow means he won't come back this time, but we're not told that. He also says a lot of things that the film isn't working hard enough to convince us of, like that Buffy is, quote, truly exceptional, and that she is giving him a harder time than any of the other Slayers ever have, and especially the notion that she's so special, she's convinced him she should break all the Slayer rules and do everything her own way. He tells her not to play their game. I just don't see where any of this comes from, and it seems to suffer from the pitfall of, this one's special because she's the one this movie decided it wanted to focus on. If it had picked that Slayer from the Middle Ages, she'd be the one Merrick finally thinks is truly exceptional and changes his whole outlook on everything. It's like if you were to write a story about a brilliant writer and reveal excerpts from his brilliant writing. You're the one who has to come up with whatever his brilliant writing is, so if you write down anything short of genius, it's unconvincing. You've set yourself up for failure. The other major pitfall the movie falls into is that, like a lot of other superhero origin films, it has a decent character arc for the hero, but is really lacking in its villain plot. Lothos is the main vampire who, for reasons we're not told, seems to only be able to awaken at a certain time, and once he does, he wants to feed on the Slayer. He can't the first time, though he's about to, because she's apparently, quote, not ready. We're not told why or even what that means. Apparently a week or two later, at the dance, she is ready. I don't really know why. Why are the vampires here? Why are they attacking now, right around the time the Slayer is figuring out her powers, and not a lot earlier? Are Lothos and the Slayer drawn to each other, so they're always unintentionally in the same place, or has every Slayer always been in L.A.? Has Lothos killed every Slayer? Does his Dracula-like hypnosis work on other people, or only on Slayers? We're just not told very much, and there's a lot of mythos here for it to be so left up in the air. Now, I realize the premise is simply a backdrop for the protagonist's character progression, but it's easy for an audience to get hung up on glaring questions like this, and that takes you out of the universe. It's harder to care about the protagonist when there's not enough credibility in the situation itself. The vampires themselves are extremely goofy. Sometimes it's genuinely funny, like when it takes Amelin forever to die when he's been impaled with a stake, and when Pike makes him lose his arm earlier and he says, "Kill him! A lot!" Actually, scratch that. Paul Rubens is just hilarious, so his vampire is really funny. And I also gotta say, Rutger Hauer, who you may know as Mr. Earl from Batman Begins, and his fantastic performance as mob boss Morgan Edge in Smallville, seems to really be enjoying himself as Lothos, despite his goofy performance. Anyway, the problem is that the horror and the comedy aren't meshing with each other. The theme of loss of innocence is hard to swallow when the bad guys aren't really menacing, and it's hard to really enjoy laughing at them when the movie is giving you mixed signals. They're this terrible threat, but they're not scary at all. You need a balance where they're both terrifying and funny at the same time, and it never does that. The closest thing to genuinely creepy we get is the dream sequence in which Buffy lies down on her bed into Lothos' arms. The camera pans, and she's in his lair and not her bedroom. I really like that, and I wish there were more scenes like it. The B-grade production values don't help either. The action is sloppy, and the soundtrack is dull synthesizer and never goes for any kind of intensity. There are some glaring, really unpolished moments, too, like the bad Foley in the car during an exchange between Buffy and Merrick. Merrick sounds like maybe he's in the car, but Buffy sounds like she's in a really echoey booth. It's very distracting. I'm going to give the Buffy movie a 1.5 out of 4. Despite the low score, I don't think it's entirely unwatchable, but some pretty great, at the time, envelope-pushing ideas are buried under bad acting, low production values, and clunky directing. It's worth seeing for some genuinely funny moments, but it's ultimately a very below-average movie.